In the hierarchy of American wealth, there are families who make money, and then there are families who define it. Most names fade with the passing of the Gilded Age, but one name remains etched into the very limestone of New York society, the walls of the world's greatest museums, and the dirt of the most prestigious racetracks: the Whitneys. They were the royal family of the American sporting class. They didn't just spend money, they curated a lifestyle of quiet luxury long before the term existed. But behind the polo matches and the debutante balls lies a story of ruthless industrial expansion, a fusion of two of the greatest fortunes in history, and a woman who dared to rebel against her own class to change the face of American art forever. This is the saga of the Whitneys, a journey through art, industry, and the secret history of America's most elegant dynasty. To understand the Whitneys, one must understand that they were not new to the concept of influence. Unlike the nouveau riche who flooded New York in the late 1800s, the Whitneys were part of the original Brahmin stock. They arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1635. John Whitney, the patriarch, was a man of the cloth and the plow, establishing a lineage of scholars, theologians, and patriots. While many associate the name with Eli Whitney, the inventor of the cotton gin, the branch of the family that would conquer New York society descended from a different path of intellectual rigor. They were the old establishment, men who went to Yale when it was a small cluster of brick buildings and who viewed public service as a birthright. The true architect of the Whitney fortune was William Collins Whitney. He was a man of immense charm and terrifying intelligence. After graduating from Yale and Harvard Law, he didn't just join the New York establishment, he rewired it. Whitney was a kingmaker. As a lawyer, he fought the corrupt Twid ring, earning a reputation of integrity. But it was in the world of transit and utilities that he struck gold. He organized the Metropolitan Street Railway Company, creating a monopoly on New York's cable cars and trolleys. Every time a New Yorker moved across the city, W.C. Whitney grew richer. His influence reached the highest levels of government. Under President Cleveland, he served as Secretary of the Navy. He is often called the father of the Great White Fleet, the man who modernized the American Navy from a collection of rotting wooden hulls into a global steel powerhouse. But W.C. Whitney knew that in New York, money and politics were only two legs of the stool. The third leg was social standing. In 1896, the social event of the century took place. William Collins Whitney's son, Harry Payne Whitney, married Gertrude Vanderbilt. This was more than a marriage, it was a merger of empires. Gertrude was the granddaughter of the Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt. She brought with her a dowry and an inheritance that dwarfed most European treasuries. The Whitneys had the political and intellectual pedigree. The Vanderbilts had the raw, railroad-driven capital. Together, they moved into a mansion at 871 Fifth Avenue, a house so opulent it featured a ballroom that could hold hundreds and a private art gallery. But Gertrude was not content to be a society matron. While her husband, Harry, obsessed over polo ponies and the family's C.V. Whitney racing stable, Gertrude was feeling the suffocating weight of her own wealth. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was expected to spend her days pouring tea and organizing charities. Instead, she secretly took up sculpture. She traveled to Paris, studied under the greats, and began to create works that were raw, powerful, and deeply human. She led a double life. By night, she was the queen of the Gilded Age. By day, she put on a smock and worked in a dusty studio in Greenwich Village, befriending starving artists who were being ignored by the conservative art establishment. It was here that the Whitney name would transition from the history of industry to the history of the soul.
Gertrude realized that the great museums like the Met were only interested in European old masters. They looked down on American artists. In a moment of high society defiance, she offered her entire personal collection of 500 American works to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, along with the money to build a new wing. They turned her down. They said American art wasn't significant enough. It was the greatest mistake in the museum's history. Gertrude's response? If they won't build a museum for American art, I will. This section dives into the sport of kings, where the Whitney fortune became legendary on the turf, and the pivotal years when Gertrude's artistic rebellion met the harsh reality of the early 20th century.
In the world of old money, how you spend your wealth is as important as how you made it. For the Whitneys, that purpose was found at the racetrack. Starting with William Collins Whitney in the 1890s, the family established a racing dynasty that would dominate American turf for over a century. W.C. Whitney didn't just bet on horses, he engineered the sport. He helped restore the Saratoga racecourse to its former glory, turning a small New York town into the summer capital of the world. But it was his son, Harry Payne Whitney, who took the family's Eton blue and brown silks to the heights of legend. In 1915, Harry's filly, Regret, made history. She was the first filly ever to win the Kentucky Derby, a feat that wouldn't be repeated for another 65 years. Harry didn't just own horses, he was a master breeder. He produced 192 stakes winners, a record that stood as a testament to the Whitney eye for excellence. To be a Whitney was to understand the bloodlines of power, both in the boardroom and in the barn. While Harry conquered the racetracks, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was being pulled into the deep grief of her era. The sinking of the Titanic in 1912 shook the very foundations of the Gilded Age elite. Many of the Whitneys' closest friends and social peers were on that ship. In 1914, Gertrude was awarded the commission to design the Women's Titanic Memorial. It was a turning point for her. People expected a dilettante heiress to produce something safe and decorative. Instead, she created a haunting 18-foot-tall figure of a man with arms outstretched, a symbol of sacrifice and the finality of the sea. This wasn't just art, it was a declaration. Gertrude was no longer a hobbyist. She was a professional sculptor who could capture the raw pain of a nation. Her social status gave her the commission, but her talent ensured it would become a national landmark. Yet, even as she gained acclaim, her world was about to be shattered by a much larger tragedy. When America entered World War I, the Whitneys didn't hide behind their millions. Harry Payne Whitney, though too old to fight, threw the family's financial weight behind the war effort. But for Gertrude, the war was personal. She didn't just donate money, she went. Gertrude established a field hospital in Juilly, France, funding it entirely out of her own pocket. She spent months surrounded by the grim reality of industrial warfare. When she returned, her art changed. The idealized statues of her youth were replaced by social realism, gritty, honest depictions of weary soldiers and the broken bodies of the working class. By 1929, Gertrude had amassed one of the world's greatest collections of American art: Edward Hopper, George Bellows, Robert Henry. She offered the entire collection, 700 pieces, to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, along with an endowment to house them. The Met's director famously told her, "We have no space for American art." It was the ultimate insult from the old guard. Gertrude's response was swift and legendary. She turned to her trusted assistant, Juliana Force, and said, "If they won't take it, we'll start our own museum." The Whitney Museum of American Art opened in 1931 in the heart of the Great Depression. While the rest of the world was collapsing, Gertrude was building a sanctuary for the American spirit. It was the first museum of its kind, dedicated not to the past, but to the living, breathing artists of the present.
This section focuses on the next generation, specifically John Hay Whitney, who transformed the family's old money into a modern media and venture capital powerhouse, and the family's involvement in the birth of the jet age.
If Gertrude was the soul of the family, her son, John Hay Whitney, known to everyone as Jock, was its engine. Inheriting a fortune estimated at nearly $100 million at the height of the Depression, Jock didn't just sit on his wealth. He possessed a restless, modern energy. He was a champion polo player, a Yale graduate, and a man who understood that the 20th century wouldn't be built on railroads, but on ideas. In the 1930s, old money looked down on Hollywood as a vulgar, new industry. Jock Whitney disagreed. He saw the power of the moving image. Alongside David O. Selznick, he formed Pioneer Pictures. Jock was the primary financier behind one of the most significant films in history, Gone with the Wind. Jock wasn't just a silent partner, he was a pioneer of Technicolor. He invested heavily in the technology that brought color to the silver screen, proving that the Whitney name could innovate as well as it could curate. By the time the movie swept the Oscars, Jock had proven that old money could be the smartest money in the room. While Jock was conquering Hollywood, his brother-in-law and close friend, Juan Trippe, was looking at the horizon. Together with the backing of Whitney Capital, Trippe founded Pan Am Airways. The Whitneys didn't just invest in an airline, they invested in the concept of a connected world. Pan Am became the chosen instrument of American foreign policy. Jock served on the board for decades, helping guide the company as it pioneered transoceanic flight and eventually ushered in the jet age. For the Whitneys, the world was no longer something to be viewed from a Newport mansion. It was something to be crossed in a single day. After serving with distinction in World War II, during which he was briefly captured by the Nazis and made a daring escape from a moving train, Jock returned to New York with a radical vision. He realized that returning soldiers and young inventors had brilliant ideas but no access to capital. In 1946, he founded J.H. Whitney & Company. This was the birth of venture capital as we know it today. Before Jock, wealthy families invested in bonds or established railroads. Jock invested in startups. He provided the seed money for companies like Minute Maid Orange Juice and Spencer Chemical. He famously said his goal was to provide capital to those who have brains and ambition but no money. In doing so, he created a model for the modern economy, proving that the greatest old money secret was knowing when to bet on new blood. The pinnacle of Jock's public life came in 1957 when President Dwight D. Eisenhower appointed him the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom. It was the ultimate old money role. Jock and his wife, Betsy Cushing Whitney, became the darlings of London society. They brought American art to the embassy walls and hosted the British royal family with a grace that few could match. Jock was the bridge between the old British aristocracy and the new American superpower. But even as he reached the height of diplomatic prestige, a new era of media was calling him home, one that would lead him to the final great struggle of his career, the battle for the New York Herald Tribune. In the late 1950s, Jock Whitney turned his attention to the one thing more influential than a movie or an airplane, the daily news. The New York Herald Tribune was the paper of the intellectual elite, the Republican alternative to the Times, but it was hemorrhaging money. In 1958, Jock bought the paper, not for profit, but for prestige and the preservation of a civilized voice in American politics. Jock wasn't just an owner, he was an advocate for quality. He hired the best writers, including a young Tom Wolfe, helping to birth the new journalism. But he was fighting a losing battle against a changing tide. Striking unions and the rise of television news were suffocating the daily city papers.
Despite pouring millions of his own dollars into the paper, the Tribune folded in 1966. It was a rare public failure for a man who seemed to have the Midas touch. Yet, from its ashes, Jock helped create the International Herald Tribune, ensuring that an American voice would continue to speak to the world from Paris. It was a lesson in the Whitney philosophy. If you cannot save the whole, you preserve the essence. While the world moved into the turbulent 1960s, the center of the Whitney universe remained Greentree. This 400-acre estate was more than a home. It was a private, sovereign nation of old money. It was here that Jock and Betsy hosted everyone from Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy to the painters and poets Jock's mother had championed. The art collection at Greentree was staggering. In one room, you might find Picasso's Boy with a Pipe, in another, a rare Gauguin. But unlike the new money collectors of today who buy art as an investment, the Whitneys lived with it. To them, a $100 million painting was simply a beautiful object in a family home. This ease with immense wealth, this quiet luxury was the hallmark of the Whitney brand. One cannot tell the story of the modern Whitney wealth without mentioning the Cushing sisters. Betsy, Minnie, and Babe Cushing were the it girls of mid-century high society. Betsy's marriage to Jock Whitney solidified a new kind of social power. They were the social dictators of New York. Through their marriages, which included Jock Whitney, Vincent Astor, and Bill Paley of CBS, they connected the worlds of old money, media, and fashion. They turned the Whitney name into a synonym for impeccable taste. If the early Whitneys were about industry, this generation was about influence. As Jock Whitney entered his final years, his focus shifted entirely to the dispersal of his fortune. He didn't believe in the dynastic hoarding of wealth. Through the Greentree Foundation and the John Hay Whitney Foundation, hundreds of millions were funneled into education, racial equality, and the arts. When Jock passed away in 1982, he left behind a legacy that was almost impossible to calculate. His widow, Betsy, continued this work, eventually donating their massive art collection worth billions to the National Gallery of Art and other public institutions. The Whitneys didn't just leave money, they left a cultural infrastructure that Americans use every day. Today, the Whitney name is carried on by a new generation. While they no longer dominate the headlines like Jock or Gertrude, their influence remains. They are venture capitalists, environmentalists, and philanthropists. But the true Whitney empire isn't a single company anymore. It is a legacy of quality. In a world that often prizes the loud and the new, the Whitneys represent the enduring power of the old school. They proved that wealth is not an end in itself, but a tool to build a navy, to find a cure, to foster an artist, and to capture the spirit of a nation. The Whitneys didn't just inherit the Gilded Age, they outlasted it. This section is a deep dive into the psyche and professional life of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. To reach your 10,000-word goal, we must expand on the nuances of her struggle, moving beyond the basic facts into the emotional and social friction she faced.
To the world in 1900, Gertrude Vanderbilt was the ultimate prize. She was the daughter of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the man who built the breakers in Newport. She was worth, in today's money, hundreds of millions before she even turned 21. But Gertrude felt like a ghost in her own life. The old money code for women was simple. Be beautiful, be silent, and be a perfect hostess. But Gertrude had a restless hand. She spent her childhood sketching in the margins of her prayer books. When she married Harry Payne Whitney, she hoped for a partner in her intellectual curiosity. Instead, she found a man obsessed with the physical world, polo, racing, and hunting. In the early years of her marriage, Gertrude performed the role of the grande dame. She hosted the balls, she wore the tiaras. But late at night, in a small room she converted into a makeshift studio, she began to move her fingers through wet clay. It was the only time she felt the weight of her name disappear. In 1901, Gertrude did something scandalous for a Vanderbilt. She traveled to Paris not to shop for gowns, but to study anatomy. She enrolled at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière. She sought out the master himself, Auguste Rodin. Imagine the scene, one of the wealthiest women on the planet, standing in a dusty, freezing studio covered in gray clay, being critiqued by the man who created the thinker. Rodin didn't care about her bank account. He cared about the line of the shoulder and the tension in the muscle. Under Rodin's influence, Gertrude's work moved away from the pretty art expected of women. She began to sculpt the human form in its rawest state, strained, powerful, and often pained. She was learning that to be a true artist, she had to kill the socialite inside her. When Gertrude returned to New York, she made a radical move. She bought a small carriage house on McDougal Alley in Greenwich Village. This was the bohemian heart of the city. Her family was horrified. A Vanderbilt woman in a slum? But for Gertrude, the alley was her sanctuary. She set up a studio that was strictly off-limits to her social peers. Here, she wasn't Mrs. Whitney, she was Gertrude. She began to host studio evenings, where she fed and supported the Ashcan School of painters, men like John Sloan and Robert Henry, who painted the gritty reality of New York life. She became the godmother of American modernism. She wasn't just buying their art, she was paying their rent, buying their coal for the winter, and giving them the one thing the old money establishment refused, a chance to be seen. Her most powerful work came from the trauma of World War I. While other sculptors were making heroic, clean monuments of generals on horses, Gertrude was sculpting the doughboy. She had seen the blood in France. She had seen the men who wouldn't be coming home. Her war monuments, like the one at 168th Street in New York, were different. They captured the exhaustion and the humanity of the common soldier. The critics were stunned. They couldn't reconcile the fact that this sensitive art was made by a woman who lived in a palace. Gertrude died in 1942, but her rebellion is immortalized in the museum that bears her name. She proved that old money doesn't have to be static, it can be a catalyst. She left behind over 200 of her own works and a collection that serves as the backbone of American art history. She was a Vanderbilt by birth, a Whitney by marriage, but a sculptor by choice. In the end, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney showed the world that the greatest luxury wealth provides isn't the ability to buy, it's the courage to create.
In the early 1930s, while America was mired in the Great Depression, the movie industry was struggling to find its footing. Studios were going bankrupt, and audiences, desperate for escape, craved spectacle. It was a time of immense risk, but for John Hay Whitney, it was also a time of unparalleled opportunity. Unlike his old money peers, who viewed Hollywood as a vulgar enterprise beneath their sophisticated tastes, Jock Whitney saw its profound power. He understood that movies were not just entertainment, they were the new narrative engine of America. With an inherited fortune that insulated him from the crash, he was uniquely positioned to gamble on the future. In 1933, Jock made his first bold move. He co-founded Pioneer Pictures. But this wasn't just another production company. Jock's vision was driven by a revolutionary technology, Technicolor. For decades, movies had been monochrome. Technicolor promised to bring the world to life, but it was expensive, temperamental, and few dared to invest in its untested potential. Jock, however, saw beyond the immediate challenges. He believed that color was the future of cinema, and he was willing to pour millions into making it a reality. Pioneer Pictures became the proving ground for Technicolor. They produced shorts and early features like Becky Sharp, 1935, the first full-length feature film entirely shot in the three-strip Technicolor process. Jock wasn't just signing checks, he was on the sets, understanding the technical challenges and pushing the boundaries of what was possible. He was a true venture capitalist before the term even existed. In 1936, a sweeping novel hit the bookshelves and instantly captured the nation's imagination. Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. Producer David O. Selznick, a man known for his grand visions, immediately saw its cinematic potential. But the price of the film rights was astronomical, $50,000, an unprecedented sum for an unknown author. Selznick had the ambition, but not the cash. He turned to the one man in Hollywood with both the fortune and the forward-thinking mindset, Jock Whitney. Jock, through Pioneer Pictures, fronted the money for the film rights and became the primary financier of the entire production. The scale of the undertaking was colossal. The film had 50 speaking roles, 2,400 extras, and a budget that ballooned to over $3.8 million, a staggering amount for the time. Jock's financial backing was not just a loan, it was a partnership. He had a profound influence on the film's development, ensuring that Selznick had the resources to bring his epic vision to life, particularly in the revolutionary use of Technicolor. The Burning of Atlanta scene alone cost over $25,000 and utilized the burning of old studio sets from King Kong and The Last of the Mohicans. It was a spectacle only possible through the sheer financial nerve provided by investors like Jock Whitney. More importantly, the entire film was shot in Technicolor, a technology that Jock had championed from its infancy. The rich hues of the southern landscape, the vibrant gowns, the emotional depth that color brought to the faces of the actors, all of it was a testament to Jock's belief in the technology. He wasn't just financing a movie, he was validating an entire artistic medium. When Gone with the Wind premiered in 1939, it was an instant phenomenon. It shattered box office records, won 8 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, and became the highest-grossing film of all time, a title it would hold for decades when adjusted for inflation. Jock Whitney's gamble had paid off beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Jock Whitney's involvement in Gone with the Wind was more than just a successful investment. It solidified his reputation as a visionary financier, one who saw the potential in nascent industries and emerging technologies. He didn't just preserve old money, he adapted it, proving that inherited wealth, when guided by intellect and foresight, could shape the future. His foray into Hollywood set the stage for his later pioneering work in venture capital, demonstrating a consistent belief in bold ideas and the power of strategic investment. The man who armed the American Navy and financed the film that defined a generation proved that the Whitney legacy was not just about holding on to wealth, but about knowing how to make it grow and how to make it matter.